Greetings ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Hylian and welcome to an encore of A Living Legacy, a journey through Final Fantasy VII. In this entry, I'll be exploring the game's presence in the Super Smash Bros. Series under the backdrop of the reforging of Nintendo and Square's relationship. It is basically the parallel epilogue to what A Living Legacy explores, focusing instead on FF7's impact to Nintendo and the events that spawned from it up until its eventual debut on Nintendo Switch and Sephiroth being added to Smash Ultimate. If you enjoyed the more documentary-esque introduction to A Living Legacy, this feature will certainly be to your liking. Now, since this is the first Encore video ever produced on this channel, it's worth explaining quickly at least what this type of video aims for before moving any further. As a major video series comes to a close, there might be instances where extra topics and events related to the analyzed work become relevant enough to warrant their own videos as a sort of bonus feature. This spans from media directly tying into the analyzed work and its legacy to interviews and content not covered in the main series. Encore videos can be uploaded anytime during or after the corresponding video series production concludes, but these bonus entries should be present at the end of the playlist to be made available over time. With this in mind, a large portion of the audience will be watching this video right after the breakdown of Final Fantasy VII's ending. Because of this, it should be obvious that, by design, this video being an encore means I'll be more liberal with exposure and discussion of spoilers pertaining to FF7. So, to those who care about not being spoiled, you've been warned. Alright, with that addressed, allow me to give my opening statements on this specific encore. In part 1 of A Living Legacy, I quickly mentioned Cloud's inclusion in Super Smash Bros. And provided a glimpse of my own reaction to Sephiroth's reveal in the series' latest entry. Due to that astonishing twist of fate, I was motivated to make a video focusing solely on Sephiroth in Smash and what his inclusion and content meant for FF7's legacy. However, I've come to realize that this encore would only feel complete if I explored instead the entire collaboration history between Nintendo and Square Enix to bring Final Fantasy VII to Super Smash Bros., as Sephiroth is only the climax of this entire story. Given the goal of my video series is also to explore the legacy of FF7, this broader approach is better suited for this endeavor. What was initially a single video for this encore grew into a two-part feature. By the time this video is released, Sephiroth's unveiling at the Game Awards will be over a year and a half old, with 2 other DLC fighters released and the final character revealed and probably released as I write this script. Hopefully I get another prediction right. By the way, quick remark here, if you're thinking this was edited after the fact just to get it right with one of my 4 predictions, know that I posted this frame weeks prior to the reveal to my Patreons. If you want to see for yourself and get sneak peeks of future projects like this and other fun tidbits, as well as being interested in supporting the channel, my Patreon awaits you through the link in the description. Now, back to the introduction at hand. As belated as this video might appear to some Smash fans, the topic of Final Fantasy VII's entry into Super Smash Bros. Is in fact timeless for what it provides as virtually the final chapter of the original game's legacy. And so, let us begin with a recap of the aftermath of FF7's release to Nintendo, digging deeper into the context surrounding it. It's a touchy subject that is not meant here to reopen old scars, but rather to clearly establish the state of the relationship between companies in which Smash would be born in, and to show how much healing would be accomplished since then. From there, I'll be exploring the parallel history of the Super Smash Bros. Series and Final Fantasy's presence in the minds of Nintendo fans and employees over the years up to the eventful year of 2015. Finally, I'll conclude part 1 of this encore with Cloud Strife's announcement for Smash 4 and breaking down the content he brought to the game. Part 2 will continue exploring the rest of the history leading up to Final Fantasy VII's debut on a Nintendo system and conclude with Sephiroth's Challenger Pack releasing for Smash Ultimate. With that said, it's time to buckle up, kind viewer, as our high wind takes off one final time to venture into a bonus chapter of the original Final Fantasy VII's legacy. It is March 14th, 1997. Final Fantasy VII has just released in Japan for the PlayStation a month and a half prior. The game garnered enormous praise and success, enough to boast over 2 million units sold in the first week alone, and almost doubling weekly hardware sales for Sony's console in that same period. FF7's success would persist for weeks on end, with constant hyping by major publications like Famitsu up until mid-March. While the PlayStation was already getting impressive sales numbers by that point, mainly for it being a cheap option as a CD player at the time, this was still one of the most significant boosts caused by a game in its entire lifespan. Meanwhile, during this 6-week period, Nintendo's console, the Nintendo 64, was selling over 10 times less than its main competitor. Because of the scenario, on this day, Nikkei Incorporated, one of Japan's largest media corporations, would broadcast a report focusing on Nintendo, interviewing then-President Hiroshi Yamauchi on the state of their console in the market and the decision of not going with CD-ROMs. What you are about to see are the highlights of this report.
でこれをこの大容量で安いという利点を生かしてね、そして開発を進めるわけですね。でそうするととにかくね、どんどん映像とか音声を垂れ流していくことになるんですよ。そうなってくるとね、今度は開発するね、開発費用っていうのはね、うなぎ登りに上がってくるんです、これ。ですからね、今回のファイナルファンタジーに見られるように、結局ね、その利益が出なくなってしまうと。だから私は、あれは一つのね、32ビット機 CD-ROM を使うソフトの限界を示したものであって、これは任天堂が前から指摘してきたことだし、私がまあ32ビット機 CD-ROM は、ね、来年までだろうという見方もそこにあるわけですね。今世界のねテレビゲームっていうのはね、どこが一番たくさん売れるかっていうとね、アメリカなんですね。一番世界でたくさん売れるね、このマーケットで問題にされてないんですよ、そういうそのドラゴンクエストとかファイナルファンタジーっていうのは。
These comments express a sentiment echoing what I alluded to back in part 1 of this video series. Nintendo, namely Yamauchi, stood confident that they made the best choice given their past frustrated attempts with CDs and could succeed even if a close partner left them. This was to the point of sounding apathetic when Square came to Yamauchi to express their concerns with the Nintendo 64 and having to leave for a competing system to fulfill their artistic vision. But there was also this atmosphere akin to a bad breakup afterwards. Despite the apparent indifference in the beginning, after Nintendo and Square parted ways, Yamauchi would express his frustration over Final Fantasy VII's departure from their system, belittling its impact and success in Japan while also questioning its profitability and potential in the West. This sentiment would continue over the years, as in 1999, Yamauchi would be interviewed again by Nikkei Shimbun on the state of the Nintendo 64 sales in comparison to PlayStation. He explained their console's performance to be worse than Sony's in Japan because, in his words, Japanese gamers like to be alone in their rooms and play depressive games. A clear reference to FF7's single-player-oriented experience featuring a darker story reflective of the artistic movement of the time. While this may seem like a simple showing of bitterness by Yamauchi, this situation is much more complicated than it might appear at first glance. If you research the topic of Nintendo and Square's conflict in the late 90s, you'll realize that the more you seek the sources and context, the more you'll notice how little there is actually to work with. While it is true and quite noticeable that Yamauchi's reaction to FF7's release was greatly fueled by regret and denial of losing such a close partner to Sony, the degree of influence that this had in his drastic measures taken afterwards is still unclear. Looking at just the point in time where Yamauchi and Squaresoft heads met to talk about FF7's future, you get conflicting accounts of the tone that took place there. In 2017, Polygon released an extensive retrospective piece on Final Fantasy VII, interviewing numerous relevant figures of the time. Those of you who look into my references throughout the series will recognize this report. In it, people such as FF7 producer Hironobu Sakaguchi and executive VP of Square USA Yoshihiro Maruyama recall Yamauchi and Nintendo not really giving them any hard time as they heard the news. Sakaguchi said Yamauchi went as far as wishing Square the best in their endeavors. Meanwhile, Maruyama's version featured a moment where the Nintendo president mentioned how the company, quote, didn't need that, most likely referring to complaints on the hardware and the need of them being together under this limiting system. However, character programmer Hiroshi Kawai expressed a completely different tone representing that conversation. He would not only paint Sakaguchi's version as being politically correct, but Kawai also cited what he heard Nintendo saying as, quote, "If you're leaving us, never come back," a far more resentful version of Maruyama's account. Now, keep in mind, this meeting took place around late 1995, before development effectively began on the game. It's hard to make the call whether the rift started this early by accounts alone, but at least it's the first event to take into consideration for this story. With this, let's take a look at another crucial event. Fast forward to around 2 weeks prior to the release of Final Fantasy VII, January 14th, 1997. Squaresoft's biggest rival, Enix Corporation, would announce on this day that Dragon Quest VII, their biggest game in years slated for release on the Nintendo 64 DD, was now going to be developed for PlayStation. Nintendo's second biggest RPG partner and their main trump card for Square's departure for the future was gone. This resulted in Nintendo's stock value falling for the following 2 days, with Sony and Enix having a significant boost with their values. The explanation publicly expressed by Enix at the time was twofold. PlayStation had a far larger consumer base in Japan, while also possessing CD-ROMs that provided a larger memory capacity to work with. This scenario on its own could have served as enough fuel to Yamauchi's bitterness in the Nikkei interview he would have 2 months later, given how FF7's hype alone could have inspired Enix to make this move and leave Nintendo. But there is an unfortunate layer to this event that would only publicly surface years later. On October 18, 2001, then Squaresoft president Hisashi Suzuki gave an interview to Nikkei Shimbun. This was a time when Square found itself in a catastrophic situation with financial losses and an exodus of employees, which motivated the company to try to fix their relationship with Nintendo and get some support from them. Such context would motivate Suzuki in this interview to open up about what happened. He mentions Yamauchi reacting lightly to the announcement of FF7 going to PlayStation, adding that the console selection, quote, couldn't be helped. After they parted ways though, the Square president would publicly bash the Nintendo 64 and convince developers behind the scenes, including Enix, to jump ship and join Sony. Hisashi Suzuki would resign from his role as president later that year and would never again give an interview on the matter. While this interview is something I wasn't able to verify directly through Nikkei because of their lack of backups of all the articles, the highlights of said interview was later published by Nintendo World Report at the time, as well as being featured in 2 different books exploring that era of Nintendo and Final Fantasy history. Polygon's 2017 retrospective also verified this, even attempting to get in contact with Hisashi Suzuki for further comment, but unfortunately this offer would end up being declined. It's worth noting that Suzuki's words would align with what then Square USA VP Shinshiro Kajitani said in Polygon's report about their business direction at the time. Quote, "From a business perspective, our main interest was making sure that Sony won and Nintendo lost, basically because that would be better for us." End quote. As you might imagine, once Nintendo found out about this, their relationship would be almost irreparably damaged. And so, fair viewer, you might then say that it was, without a doubt, Suzuki's antics that were the initial motivators for Yamauchi's bitterness with FF7. Right? Well, not exactly. While this is probably the most egregious factor that deteriorated their relationship, it's unclear whether this was the starting point. There is no public statement on when this came to be known by Nintendo. As this was something done behind the scenes, Suzuki's direction for the business department would only be known through an intelligence inquiry and investigation by Yamauchi around the time of the announcement of Dragon Quest VII for the PlayStation at the very least. We can only speculate how long it would have taken for Yamauchi to find out. If I were to give my take on what the cause of Yamauchi's stance on FF7 was, I would say that it was simply Squaresoft leaving Nintendo over their hardware. This is because Square going for a competitor after years of partnership and support, however limited that was, would be seen as a sort of betrayal of their relationship. Rather than adapting their vision to the limitations of the Nintendo 64 as a way to value their relationship, Square would instead favor keeping their vision intact and go for a different party, one that attempted to exploit Nintendo in the past with their first attempt at making a CD-ROM based console. In a culture that immensely values loyalty among business partners, This move would be received in a bad light very easily by a business head as traditional and assertive as Yamauchi seemed to be. Do not be mistaken. I'm not saying that FF7 devs and Square heads looking for a platform to fulfill their technical needs was a dishonorable deed. In fact, I sympathize with them and understand their position, and I think that aiming for the artistic vision to be intact is something worth prioritizing. My commentary in A Living Legacy Part 1 should illustrate this clearly. I'm just saying that this is something that could be very easily perceived as something offensive by someone who isn't sensible enough to understand this scenario in full and is likely biased towards one side's honor above all else. Given how politeness and etiquette are important in Japanese social relations, I think that this sentiment was probably not clearly expressed by Yamauchi at the time, but word of his disapproval and resentment eventually would spread at some point, which would explain the tone of all accounts given by the parties involved. Whatever the cause of Yamauchi's resentment for FF7 may have truly been, the Nikkei interview from March 1997 that opened this Encore would be the first major public statement that highlighted the tone of conflict between Nintendo and Squaresoft. It might have been just a fraction of the full picture of the situation, but that interview was a tone setter that would dictate how artists within their respective companies would be able to relate and publicly express mutual inspiration. In the end, this event and the full context surrounding it should give you an idea of the scenario that would define the environment within Nintendo and Square for that generation onwards. As someone who grew up in that time with the SNES and considers himself to this day a Nintendo fan, it was quite sad and an enormous loss back then to see all of this unfold, and through the study of this history, it is unfortunate to realize how much of this was a result of miscommunication between numerous parties and of pressure spawned from previous failed attempts due to a variety of reasons. This breakup had an immense impact in the dedicated consumer base for Nintendo, as many fans who saw Final Fantasy as a virtual second-party franchise to the hardware powerhouse would now see the biggest title in the series land on a different platform under a marketing push that painted Nintendo in a position of ridicule. Many Nintendo fans of my generation would end up buying a PlayStation on top of the Nintendo 64 specifically because of FF7, and I can attest to this from my own experience. This release would reshape the fan communities for both Nintendo and Final Fantasy. On the Nintendo side, a lot of the people getting into games as a medium this generation would learn about consoles and franchises through the lens of the N64's library. They would experience a lack of RPGs in their formative years and end up having a view of Final Fantasy clashing with the predominant perspective from older fans. Newer fans would see the JRPG Goliath as a Sony-oriented work, one that wouldn't be relevant for Nintendo moving forward given the genre's lack of presence for their system in general. Meanwhile, older fans would still see the franchise as a series with artistic tendencies aligned with Nintendo works despite its presence on a competing platform. When it comes to how this scenario affected the Final Fantasy fandom specifically, most of the fans from the Nintendo era would still be around to witness an immense growth and reach that the series would get from the mainstream success of FF7. However, this new generation would be comprised of folks mainly exposed to the different breed of art that the PlayStation was providing, which would end up shaping the very profile of this young part of the fandom. In the end, both communities found themselves in an era of rebirth, where new generations of fans would stand out more than ever and redefine the consumer base. While big changes were taking place with the company relations and within their respective fandoms, on the artistic front, both Nintendo and Squaresoft would continue to produce works that shared similar foundations with their predecessors. Artists would look to each other's major titles to find inspiration that couldn't be verbalized until over a decade later, when company relations weren't as sour. I mentioned in the epilogue of A Living Legacy how Final Fantasy VII would arguably find its way as inspiration in one way or another for major Nintendo titles like The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask and Mother 3. When looking at Nintendo influencing Square, outside of Final Fantasy inheriting the artistic foundations of the past in the Sakaguchi produced titles, you have something like Kingdom Hearts. This is a series that would only come to fruition starting on the PlayStation 2, but its conception had in large part originated from a creative spark that FF7 character designer Tetsuya Nomura had with Nintendo's Super Mario 64 back in 1996. In his words, as he was working on Final Fantasy VII, his contact with Super Mario 64 made a big impact on him, spawning his desire to make a 3D game in that style. Nomura would be told his dream project of making a game to match Nintendo's milestone title would require the use of characters that could match Mario's popularity, namely from something like Walt Disney's franchises. His wish would come true as FF7 lead producer Hironobu Sakaguchi and FF7 publicity producer Shinji Hashimoto were considering a project with Disney, and they ended up naming Nomura to be its director. This influence from Super Mario 64 would be felt the strongest in the first entry of Kingdom Hearts, where platforming and the close-up controllable camera would have a significant presence in the gameplay experience. So, as you can see, the artistic alignment between Nintendo and Squaresoft was still strong amidst the turmoil happening in other areas. With all of that said, this full scenario establishes the setting of the late 1990s for both companies. And ironically, it is right around the time the situation was beginning to unravel that the long journey of healing and recovery would be set in motion.
How do you feel about games like The Legend of Zelda, both old and new?
Yeah, I love Zelda.
It begins not within Nintendo nor Squaresoft, but rather in a small company from a small town known at the time as Ryo. This company was in the process of recovery after being on the verge of bankruptcy, from which they were saved by Nintendo's support years prior. Much like Squaresoft in the past, these folks were third-party developers that migrated from Japanese PC platforms to work exclusively on Nintendo platforms, eventually getting recognition for their work to the point of them becoming a virtual second-party developer to Nintendo. And, quite curiously, these same devs would also get the opportunity to create a hidden gem of an RPG to be published by Squaresoft later down the line. This company was HAL Laboratory. It was around October 1996 when HAL Laboratory was coming off the heels of million-selling titles from the Kirby series and seeing an increasing success of the Mother series, their very own JRPG franchise. The company was closer to Nintendo than ever before, with expectations of delivering a strong support for the Nintendo 64, especially through titles like Mother 3, the one big JRPG left to land on the system after it eventually lost both FF7 and Dragon Quest VII to PlayStation. And it was during this time when talks began between HAL Laboratory president Satoru Iwata and the company's creative lead Masahiro Sakurai on their next major project to pitch for Nintendo. Their discussions would lead them to work on prototypes of two different project ideas, an action-adventure game and a 4-player battle royale fighting game. On May 1997, Sakurai and Iwata presented their work to Nintendo, garnering a warm reception for both projects. When deciding on which of the two should be chosen to enter development, the action-adventure game was Nintendo's favored option. However, sometime after this pitch took place, one of HAL Laboratory's major projects, Kirby's Air Ride, had to be abandoned. With a newfound gap in HAL's game release schedule, Sakurai and Iwata turned to their platform fighting game idea as their new priority, given the short development time the project would demand to complete it. By this point in time, the game already had its core design established as a platform fighter, using percentage-based damage and knockback escalation from the prototype they've previously worked on, known simply as Kakutou Gemu Ryo. However, that prototype had no distinguished characters to define its roster. Masahiro Sakurai would think of a number of options to decide what kind of cast they will go for in their project, from a new set of dog characters to beloved Kirby characters. Out of all considerations though, the idea most entertained by Sakurai was an all-star Nintendo cast. Today, in an age where works like The Avengers, Justice League, and Godzilla vs. Kong reach mainstream status, we might take the impact and magnitude of a crossover like this for granted, but back in the late 1990s, all-star casts weren't common. Probably the most high-profile crossover by that point in audiovisual media was the 1988 classic Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and even then, the crossover itself was more of a background element rather than the focus of the work. Satoru Iwata even recalled in an Iwata Asks interview how people back then had reservations on mobilizing an all-star cast. In response to this, in that same interview, Sakurai mentioned that he saw this approach as a strong solution to the demands of making the characters in his game stand out, highlighting the atmosphere that a fighting game made for home consoles needed. In his view, fighting games made for arcades could get away with having barely any character development because of players being content with just the fighting experience. That wasn't the same for fighting games made for consoles. Making his game's characters carry a legacy of development from their source material would provide the substance needed to convey the atmosphere and game world Sakurai deemed so important for a work of that kind. And this, dear viewer, is a mindset that reflects two of the franchise's three core principles to keep in mind for our journey, as they influence the series to this day and explain Final Fantasy VII's presence in Super Smash Bros. The aspect of the crossover approach that was valued the most here wasn't necessarily the number of franchises being represented, as many Smash fans would mistakenly assume. Instead, it was the presence of the characters themselves and the legacy each of them carry. This importance given to legacy embodied by characters would be the first defining philosophy for this crossover franchise from its inception. And as said previously, the inheritance of all this history served to build an atmosphere and the game world Smash would take place in. The fact that there was a concern over building a world that the cast should fit in coherently also points to an effort by Sakurai at having the roster possess an overarching theme, one that would be able to unify characters from very different series, genres, and art styles. This unifying element seems to be what I would call the Nintendo DNA. To be more specific, this quote-unquote DNA refers to the artistic philosophies that Nintendo identifies with in terms of creation and presentation, which could be perceived in a particular character and the work they come from. These philosophies span from the appeal to a classical approach in audiovisual aesthetics to the attempt at making the work and its contents carry an appeal and reach that are able to transcend cultural boundaries. While never explicitly specified, you can notice this selection requirement not only in how the series roster evolved over each generation, but also through remarks from Sakurai such as these on screen. The attempt at unifying characters from such different worlds and designs that possess a shared, or at the very least, a closely related artistic foundation is, in conclusion, the second fundamental philosophy driving Smash Bros. This even dictated how art direction was handled, seen as recently as in the series' latest entry. As you might imagine, this philosophy would also be the very basis for selecting characters not created by Nintendo themselves in later entries in the series. Well, for the most part anyways. With the crossover approach being decided as the priority option for the project's roster design, Iwata and Sakurai would take on the challenge of making the use of characters from different intellectual properties a reality. Protagonists from Nintendo-owned series created by HAL Laboratory like Kirby and Ness were basically a given to be included in the roster. The first real challenge, and probably the most important one, was getting the approval of Nintendo game designer Shigeru Miyamoto for them to proceed with the project using his characters. Getting this support was crucial, not only for getting these legendary icons to be at the forefront of the cast and sell the game, but Miyamoto's approval would also cascade into getting more than half the roster filled by characters from series he had a direct creative hand in. Iwata went to Miyamoto alone to pitch the project, but the idea was rejected, probably due to concerns for how the characters would be portrayed in the context of a fighting game. Iwata wouldn't leave empty-handed though, as he did at least get permission to use Miyamoto's characters on a prototype to show him better the potential behind the idea, as the Nintendo designer was open to give them a second chance. The stakes behind this challenge were kept secret even from Sakurai, who would say in an interview that, had he known of Miyamoto's initial rejection and the full scope of the importance of nailing this prototype, he would have probably dropped the crossover idea entirely and Smash as we know it wouldn't have come to fruition. With this scenario set, Sakurai and his team began development on the demo. The main goals were defined as follows. Make a functioning prototype of the game featuring Mario and others where the mechanics are conveyed amidst an accurate depiction of the characters on screen. They needed to make Miyamoto and the rest of Nintendo believe the quality behind the prototype was as if the IP holders were handling it, and most importantly, the characters should look and feel faithful to their original counterparts. The work put into this prototype would reflect the final core philosophy of Super Smash Bros. That should be relevant to keep in mind for our story. This philosophy is defined by the value and importance given to detail on every level of presentation and interactive mechanics to build the most faithful version of a character possible. This mindset would even be mentioned by Sakurai when talking about the process he went through when trying to get the Pokemon Company's approval for using 2 of their characters in this platform fighter. Don't be mistaken, their aim for extreme accuracy may have come as a necessity for the series to even have a shot at existing, but this was an ideology ingrained in the project by Sakurai himself independently from such demands. Coming from experience as someone responsible for the creation of a successful IP, Sakurai knew how important it is for an artist and fans of his work to see his creation be accurately portrayed in whichever work their IP may be present. And he was long enough in the business to face situations where his character would be mischaracterized by others, causing him significant annoyance. If it were his responsibility to handle a character that isn't his, it would be his duty not to betray the creator's original vision. In Sakurai's words, Super Smash Bros. Was in part a reaction to the sloppy handling of IPs that plagued media and fandoms back then. Oh, if only he knew how much worse this was going to get over the following decades. Given Nintendo was well known for being artistically conservative, this philosophy would be a perfect fit to the pitch. As the prototype reached its completion, it was shown to Miyamoto and met with enormous praise. The project would proceed with getting authorization for the remaining desired characters and developing the rest of the game's features. Super Smash Bros. For the Nintendo 64 would be released on January 21, 1999 to significant fan acclaim. Despite the initially negative reaction from some critics and slow sales in the first few weeks, the game would be released worldwide and the general reception got more positive as people got to understand the design of a platform fighting game, with the title being one of the rare cases in Japan where a work was still going strong in sales numbers and public discourse over half a year after release. The game would already get its first competitive tournament at Nintendo's 1999 Space World, reportedly generating the longest line in the show with a wide-ranging demographic that caught the attention of organizers and Sakurai himself. The Nintendo All-Star crossover proved to be a success. By this point in time, the next generation of consoles was on the horizon, as the PlayStation 2 was getting unveiled almost 1 month after Nintendo's Space World event at the 1999 Tokyo Game Show, while the successor to the Nintendo 64, the Nintendo Gamecube, was already reported to be in development. The Nintendo 64 was nearing the end of its run, with most of the big third-party titles already migrated to competing consoles, while the next major first-party titles were either slated for the console's expansion or indefinitely delayed. The Nintendo 64 DD, after numerous delays of its own, was about to release in December of that same year. Amidst this period of transition in the industry, HAL Laboratory would plan their next major steps. Mother 3, the biggest title being developed at the company, would be delayed again. Kirby 64 was nearing completion, and so Sakurai already started considering projects for the next generation. Among those ideas, a sequel to Super Smash Bros. Came to light, but before getting to work on it, an official poll would be conducted to hear from fans what characters they wish to see in a theoretical Smash 2. Now, you might recall from earlier that I mentioned how the Nintendo fandom was redefined by FF7's departure from the N64. As this poll was taken at the end of the generation, you would probably be inclined to bet Final Fantasy wouldn't get a significant demand anymore compared to other non-Nintendo series. Well, let's look at the results. The most popular characters, specifically Nintendo ones and those who made a strong presence on the N64, made double-digit numbers in votes. The highest voted character not made by Nintendo was James Bond from GoldenEye 007, a film character that defined the generation by Rare's industry landmark first-person shooter. His tie to Rare, a company considered second party to Nintendo, made him not be tallied as a non-Nintendo character for some reason. So who topped the list for third-party characters then? Only 6 characters made the list. Was it Sonic, the biggest gaming rival to Mario? Maybe Mega Man, another massive icon that got to join the crossover right after Sonic did. As crazy as it sounds, both got the bottom spots with 3 votes each. Maybe Crash Bandicoot, he was basically PlayStation's mascot and a platformer character after all. Also no. He got just 1 vote over Sonic and Mega Man. Not even Bomberman, a character with 3 major titles released on the N64 internationally, got the top spot, overcoming even the anime and manga icon Doraemon, Chocobo, the mascot for the Final Fantasy series, got the biggest support from fans. Even in a time knowing how unlikely a partnership between Nintendo and Square would be, the fans still favored Final Fantasy, with the vote count matching highly requested Nintendo characters like Princess Zelda and Falco, who would indeed be selected for the roster in the future. You might then ask, okay, but why give so much attention to such a small poll? This doesn't represent the accurate numbers for the entire fandom. Aren't you grasping at straws because of a favorable result to Final Fantasy? Going by its sample size, it's obvious it's not a good estimate of what all fans would want. Accuracy to popularity within a fandom is hardly ever accomplished, even through a poll with dozens of thousands of votes in a consumer base of millions of people, a scope achieved today by some fan polls. The relevance behind this poll lies instead in how it influenced the future of the series, being enough to give Sakurai an idea of some rough proportions surrounding demands for certain characters and franchises to validate and monitor over time. Keep in mind, this was an online poll at a time when the internet was in its infancy. The highest voted character, Bowser, was the only one to get votes in the triple digits, so despite the small number of votes compared to the engagement you see in polls today, these results were a testament to the portion of the fandom most actively engaged with the official communication platforms on the internet. And if you look at the results of this poll, you'll really notice how much it seemed to have been used as reference for picking characters in the next entries up until Smash 4, right when the next official poll would take place. Final Fantasy being at the top of the third-party list would, in a way, plant the seed that would grow into the payoffs we would get over 15 years later, and it showed that a strong attachment to Final Fantasy was still present among Nintendo consumers despite recent events. As we'll see later, the requests for Chocobo, specifically in this time, would evolve and take the form of Cloud Strife becoming the forefront of FF requests over the generations of Smash releases. And so we conclude the series' inception, the era of Smash 64, and move on to the next chapter of the story. By this point, you should be familiarized with the creators of this crossover series, the philosophies that define them and their work, the ongoing presence Final Fantasy had within the Nintendo fanbase, and how this was reflecting in fan demands for characters to be added in future installments. We now move on to a period of immense change within both Nintendo and Square and the defining moment for Super Smash Bros.
例えば「スター・ウォーズ」なら「スター・ウォーズ」の世界が表現されているっていうことが重要なんですね。原作をいかに表現しているかとか、だから逆に言えばここでゲーム性がとか語り始めるのははっきり言えば野暮です。原作の世界をうまく楽しめればそれで十分魅力的なソフトになり得るんですね。逆に言えば原作をぶち壊しにするような作品みたいなものは、大抵の場合は好かれません。
It is now 2001, and a lot has changed in the industry. Microsoft, who joined the video game console market with the Xbox, while Sega, a powerhouse in the SNES days and a rival to Nintendo at the time, was discontinuing their console, the Sega Saturn, and dropping out of the hardware business that same year. For the first time in history, Nintendo was dealing with defeat in sales from the previous console generation, trying to get their next system, the Nintendo Gamecube, to be able to face the PlayStation 2 and the new competition. At least they learned their lesson with cartridges from the Nintendo 64. Right? Well, in part. They dropped cartridges as their storage media option in favor of proprietary mini DVDs, which possessed more memory storage than even CD-ROMs employed for PlayStation. But their adoption of mini DVDs over DVDs would put their system at a disadvantage, as the chosen storage media had almost 3 times less memory storage than a DVD had. This was done, though, as part of Nintendo's goal to build the console as cheap to produce and as developer-friendly as possible, both in cost and practicality on the developer's end. The GameCube would indeed garner a significant amount of third-party support back throughout the generation. One of the companies to get back on board was none other than Square Enix. Kind of. But I shouldn't get ahead of myself. Let's continue with the journey at hand by looking at the manner in which Nintendo would establish their presence in the generation in 2001. The GameCube already had numerous games and tech demos shown at Space World in the year prior, but the following E3, the largest video game expo in the West, would be the stage where Nintendo's game plan would be fully unveiled. Their conference started off with the introduction of Satoru Iwata as being a member of Nintendo's board of directors and the head of planning for the company. Indeed, Iwata became a Nintendo employee under those very roles in 2000 as a result of his work at HAL Laboratory. He effectively got HAL back on its feet after Nintendo support and had a pivotal role in getting important games done in the 90s for Nintendo systems, especially in their time of need during the N64 era. It was now his role at Nintendo to evaluate the market and study ways to reduce production costs and development time while maintaining high quality. He would also be credited for spearheading Nintendo's pursuit of specific third-party developers for this generation onwards, and this likely applied to Square. While sources often cite Namco, Sega, and Capcom as examples, Square's gradual return to Nintendo starting from the GameCube and its portable counterpart, the Game Boy Advance, highly suggests Iwata aimed for their old partner from the onset, in parallel to Square's own contextual needs at the time. And I'm willing to bet this was likely driven by both Final Fantasy VII's history and impact in the previous generation and the official poll for the sequel to Super Smash Bros. Held when he was still at HAL. We'll see more signs of this initiative from Iwata as the story unravels, so keep that in mind as we progress. The fact that Iwata was hired and given a high position at Nintendo was a big statement to how much HAL Laboratory gained importance to the company. That reverence to HAL would be epitomized following Iwata's speech, as Shigeru Miyamoto would come on stage to present the first GameCube title in the show, a review of Super Smash Bros. Melee, the sequel to the N64 hit. This was a game developed by HAL and produced by Miyamoto himself, a testament to the investment and trust put in the creative direction and reputation of a company that was just a third-party partner less than a decade earlier. The review would also be a massive statement on the artistic tools and technical performance they were aiming to capitalize on given their history from the previous generation. To the average Smash fan watching, what is seen here is basically Melee's opening they've seen many times by now, but the presentation choices carried a significant impact back then. This reveal was defined by the impressive FMVs and the fully orchestral score. Indeed, Nintendo was now embracing a tool that Final Fantasy VII popularized in the previous generation, and they would show how memory limitations weren't holding the system back in its implementation like it used to. This message would be caught on by people including the press, who would highlight how this polished FMV was a statement of how Nintendo was evolving in this new generation. The orchestral music as the backdrop of this bombastic celebration of Nintendo's history also pointed to the grandiose scope they were going for artistically. The final product would even implement live performances during gameplay, from themes playing in certain stages to victory fanfares for characters and game over screens. Continue. Game over. It was such an important feature for the game that sound effects designer Tadashi Ikegami recalled how Sakurai told the music team in their first meeting that using a live orchestra was absolutely going to happen, even if he had to pay for it in case Nintendo wasn't giving them the necessary budget. They did, by the way. Shogo Sakai, who previously worked as a composer for games in the Glory of Heracles series, also joined the team, mainly due to his experience with arranging and conducting for orchestras as well as working with concert organizers. His efforts of searching for the right orchestra and conductor would lead Sakurai's team to the New Japan Philharmonic led by Taizo Takemoto. Takemoto was a conductor known at the time for his work in 1991's Fantasia Cinema Live, a concert that performed the entire soundtrack of Walt Disney's 1940 classic Fantasia, following the film accordingly as it was displayed on the screen at the event. Fortunately for Sakurai's team, Takemoto was already a big Nintendo enthusiast beforehand and wanted to conduct for video games for some time, so things went even smoother than initially foreseen. Keep Takemoto-san in the back of your head, by the way, as he is going to be a pretty relevant figure later in this story. This orchestral approach to music, promoted since the game's review, would be such a big part of the game's identity and appeal that a concert was held in the year after Melee's release to massive success. In a country where concert etiquette is highly respected and followed, even in events performing music from popular modern media, Melee's concert generated this reaction in its conclusion. triumphant, impactful. Quite the impression, isn't it? It shows the cultural meaning Smash was gaining over time. Whether Final Fantasy's implementation of orchestral recordings to FMVs, starting with FF7, served as inspiration for Melee's musical direction is something left for your speculation, but the presentation design of both series following a classical approach would end up bringing these works and artists together in more ways than one. Super Smash Bros. Melee, while not a launch title, went on to become the flagship work for the GameCube. The game released to near universal acclaim, being the best-selling title on the console to this day and cementing Smash as a mainstay Nintendo franchise. The scope of the crossover would expand tremendously, with new characters and stages that ended up more than doubling the amount of content the original Smash on the N64 had. It's worth noting a few things from this growth. The expansion of the crossover through the cast was mainly done by adding characters that further enriched the representation of franchises that had already debuted in the previous Smash entry. Of the 14 new characters in Melee, only 4 came from the 3 new franchises added. This situation evidenced the importance given to getting the representation of priority franchises complete, or at least with a solid enough foundation before introducing new IPs and their universes. This philosophy would dictate Smash's roster selection for generations until the latest entry in the series, where new franchises outnumbered already present ones among the newcomers. This philosophy, though, would still be epitomized by a few noteworthy characters. The other thing to note from Melee's selection of new characters is how much it delivered on the official poll I touched on earlier. Most of the top voted characters by series or type of franchise got in the game. The exceptions to this were rare related characters and non-Nintendo characters. They weren't considered viable at the stage, most likely due to how crossovers still weren't mainstream enough to make the legal hurdles easier to overcome, on top of Smash itself not having that powerful of a presence in the medium yet. In fact, this reputation only started to get traction with Melee. Sakurai would only realize the viability of non-Nintendo characters when he got contacted by the creators of Sonic the Hedgehog and Metal Gear Solid series to include their protagonists in his game after Melee's review at E3 2001. The fact that the release date was just around the corner made their inclusion impossible, but those requests would definitely be kept in mind for the future. Perhaps the biggest expansion of Smash's crossover title, however, lied in the new modes and collectibles. In accordance to the epic scope suggested by the game's opening, Melee introduced an adventure mode, a journey the player takes through side-scrolling stages, cutscenes, and battles that take place in the worlds of the characters in the roster, leading to a climactic fight against Nintendo's biggest villain, Bowser. The side-scrolling stages in particular explored completely different locales from the ones seen in normal stages, serving to further land home Smash's goal of bringing the worlds of this crossover together into one cohesive universe. The collectibles that gave the game even more content came in the form of trophies, statues that the player can acquire through numerous means and can be observed in detail in the gallery. Trophies encompassed playable characters as well as non-playable characters, items, and locales from franchises represented in the roster, in addition to franchises that didn't get that opportunity yet. The amount of content from different universes seen here was staggering. Every single trophy even had a description and a brief history surrounding it. The crossover defining Smash wasn't just an event and an encounter of these different universes, the characters in the roster and their respective stages anymore. The crossover was now also a platform for a celebration of history, a history of Nintendo's artistic endeavors and the legacy they carried throughout the generations. In conclusion, Super Smash Bros. Melee was the title that put the series in the spotlight for the industry moving forward as a result of its magnitude and elite roster. It elevated its crossover appeal to new heights, and, in many ways, it was the living testament to how far HAL Laboratory came from a third-party developer to one of the closest internal studios for Nintendo. After Melee's impactful release, the series would stay dormant for the rest of the console generation. And so, kind viewer, the history of Melee's creation and context should give you an idea of Smash's philosophy to roster selection, presentation, and its approach to crossover for its identity. The connections to Final Fantasy by this point in time in the story have been scarce, but this will soon change. Let's continue by exploring Nintendo and Square's evolving relationship during this period. As I've said previously, the first years of this new generation in the medium was a time of fundamental changes within those companies. Melee already gave the industry an idea of how much Nintendo was changing its approach to tools like FMVs and how much their powerful hardware was capable of. The GameCube, being designed with third-party developers in mind, also enhanced this change. Perhaps the biggest endeavor to embody this effort of drawing in third-party companies was FundQ, a startup aimed at supporting venture businesses tied to software development. This fund, organized by Nintendo President Yamauchi, offered collateral-free loans to companies interested in developing games for the GameCube and its portable counterpart, the Game Boy Advance. Among the supported ventures was the partnership between Nintendo and Squaresoft? Well, this is where things start to get interesting on a corporate level. To explain how this scenario even became possible, it's important to recall the state Square found itself during this period. Since this is a topic already covered in the epilogue of A Living Legacy, I'll make this brief for those that are watching only for the Smash part of this story. Despite the impact of Final Fantasy VII and how it boosted Square and its other releases in the late 90s into further success, the company would find itself in its worst crisis less than even half a decade after FF7's release. Said game's subject matter and its cinematic achievements, on top of its borderline legendary reception, inspired Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi to work on the feature-length film, later known as Final Fantasy Spirits Within, that continued to explore some of the concepts present in Final Fantasy VII. This project demanded a huge amount of resources from Squaresoft and dedication from Sakaguchi as they opened Square Pictures, a new subsidiary focused on CGI animation for films and bringing those advancements to Square's future games. This film's production would have Sakaguchi so busy that he wouldn't even be significantly involved in the next Final Fantasy entry, as well as not having much time supervising many other Square titles. Instead, he would be mainly working on Parasite Eve and the concepts for what would become Final Fantasy IX in parallel over the years. Final Fantasy Spirits Within released in theaters on July 2, 2001, to middling reception and a low return in the box office that failed to compensate for its astronomical budget of $137 million. This performance caused a loss of almost $100 million to Square and Sony combined, one of the biggest losses ever recorded in film history. This happened amidst Sakaguchi and other heads having resigned from their positions for the losses already acquired in the previous fiscal year, caused primarily by the delay of Final Fantasy X, among many other important reasons. On top of all of this, numerous other artists were leaving the company over the previous half-decade, seeking to work for Nintendo or start their own companies, due to issues with Square's management and creative freedom, as seen with Monolith Soft, Love Delic, Saknoth, Alpha Dream, and Brownie Brown, later known as Nintendo's 1UP Studio. So, as you can see, Square was in a severe crisis in 2002, and they desperately needed to make money to get back on their feet and make up for the financial and personnel losses. This is partially what motivated their reliance on sequels and spin-offs to Final Fantasy games, as well as living on the promises of revisiting the past. And it is in this scenario that Square would see in Nintendo an opportunity to recover. Despite Sony owning 19% of the company at the time, Square was allowed to develop for Nintendo under the condition that it didn't affect the development of major titles on the PlayStation 2. In other words, new mainline entries in their major franchises and any other significant projects slated for Sony's system would have to skip Nintendo's system, as it could affect the release dates for games on PS2. New spin-offs and ports of old games, however, were fair game. Thus, Square would have a new team dedicated to bringing spin-offs like Crystal Chronicles, FF Tactics Advance, and ports of old mainline FF games to Nintendo GameCube and GBA. FF7 couldn't be brought over yet because Square had major plans for its future and Sony's platform was given priority. This minimalist presence on Nintendo's hardware would define the relationship between the companies for the entirety of the generation. The partnership may not have been enough to save the GameCube, but it helped Nintendo's portable significantly, while Square started to find a path to recovery. It was a small, but meaningful, start to their fated reunion. Now, before we move on to the next major episode in Smash's relationship with FF7 and its artists, I should draw your attention to two major events that happened shortly after Square's partnership with Nintendo through FundQ that are important to keep in mind. On May 24, 2002, it was announced that Hiroshi Yamauchi would be stepping down as president of Nintendo, and in his place, Satoru Iwata would take his spot. This change in leadership would plant the seeds for further approximation between Nintendo and third-party companies, including Square. And finally, as the year was coming to a close, Squaresoft and Enix Corporation would announce their merger to take effect in the following year, giving birth to Square Enix. The specifics behind this merger and its consequences won't be explored in detail in this video, given its presence in the epilogue of A Living Legacy. What's important to know is that the company's philosophy, both corporate and artistic, was changing drastically amidst further migration of old talents out of the company. Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi was among those people, creating his own business, Mistwalker, years after his departure. The bad side to this series of events is that a lot of series owned by Square would lose a lot of the creative vision and direction that it once had due to the absence of important leadership figures, among other reasons. The bright side, at least to Nintendo, is that the merger implied more IPs and assets owned by the same company, which meant more opportunities for partnerships, ports, and spin-offs that allow for communication that creates this new climate between artists and corporations. Meanwhile, independent old Square talent would get their own collaborations and projects in which Nintendo could benefit from. Indeed, most of these opportunities would materialize. And with that, we can proceed with Smash history, this time finally featuring a direct contact with FF7 artists. But, differently from what many in the audience might be assuming, this major event didn't take place by virtue of the next title in the series. Instead, it was at the concert hall that the connection between artists would start to take shape.
And of course, I believe that when you increase the number of worlds, you're also increasing the number of people that could potentially enjoy that, the video game and the different series that you're putting in there. But that does present a problem because having these non-traditional, non-Nintendo characters in the game, even with just Snake and Sonic, has resulted in a number of people who do dissent in seeing these characters put into the Smash series. And so it's not a simple matter of just simply adding as many new worlds and new characters from different games as possible. You can't be careless in doing that sort of thing. You need to be careful.
It is now 2005. This is the year Square Enix released Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, the company's second attempt at filmmaking and their starting point for the expansion of FF7 into a series of its own. This was also the year that Nintendo president Satoru Iwata would approach Masahiro Sakurai, now a freelancer, to direct the next Super Smash Bros. And start its development soon after. But perhaps the most interesting event that year involving these artists took place in a pub somewhere in Japan. Details on exact time and place were never disclosed, but what is known is that a nomikai, a private Japanese drinking party, was held by 5 gentlemen: Smash Bros. Director Masahiro Sakurai, Melee composer Shogo Sakai, conductor Taizo Takemoto, Final Fantasy VII composer Nobuo Uematsu, and Final Fantasy VII scenario writer Kazushige Nojima. Whether they all knew each other prior, or if this was an occasion where a contact common to different groups of artists made a connection, is unknown. I actually tried reaching out to Takemoto-san for an interview that could help clear up some things about the story and more, but unfortunately it wasn't possible to get any response. When asking Shogo Sakai, however, he did give a lot more context, but not enough to paint the full picture. Because of this, I can only work with what little information there is available online and the added context by Sakai-san to construct the likeliest scenario for this important meeting. In Japanese culture, nomikais are usually held to celebrate important events in one's professional or academic life, be it the completion of a major project or the start of a new career or partnerships. With this in mind, we might have a time frame and context to work with. The thing these 5 artists have in common were their major professional milestones being achieved or set close to each other. Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, which Uematsu and Nojima worked on for years, released on September 14, 2005. Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Sakurai and Sakai's next project, officially started development the following month, so a late September nomikai celebrating these events makes sense. With regards to the relationship between these artists prior to this nomikai, we can start off with Shogo Sakai and Kazushige Nojima being co-workers for the Glory of Heracles series. According to Sakai-san, he also met Uematsu in 2000 on a separate occasion, a little after presenting Taizo Takemoto to Sakurai to conduct for Smash Bros. Melee. We can say for sure at least that Sakai-san knew everyone before this fondly remembered nomikai. So, can we owe Sakai-san our thanks for this fateful event? In good part, yes. But I believe the catalyst for this party was actually a different person. While the possibility of them all being friends amongst each other for some time off the record is something relevant to consider, I believe these two groups of people were mainly introduced to each other in this event by none other than Taizo Takemoto himself by virtue of Shogo Sakai's own history, and I have good reason to believe he was the pivotal player here. I already mentioned Takemoto-san's work with Sakurai for Smash Bros. Melee and its eventual concert in this video. What I didn't say is that, in parallel to Melee's concert, Squaresoft hired Takemoto-san to conduct the first Final Fantasy concert in 13 years, 2002-0220, music from Final Fantasy. Whether he got this opportunity also because of Fantasia Cinema Live or due to his work on Melee is currently unknown, but the positive reception to this new FF concert would lend the conductor further opportunities as he was chosen to perform in the following Final Fantasy concert, Tour de Japon. However, the pinnacle of this relationship between Takemoto-san and Final Fantasy was him being hired by Square Enix to conduct for most of the new orchestral music and recordings for Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. As you can see, Taizo Takemoto is very clearly the man that was involved with every person in the nomikai by that point, and it was probably because of his work in the FF7 sequel and Brawl's development kicking off that he was able to get these artists together. I guess even a film as atrocious and frustrating as Advent Children can bring something great and long-lasting to the world of art. Maybe the long-term result of this curious incident was the universe bringing balance to what this film and its legacy would bring over the years. I guess we'll never know. Moving on, in this nomikai there came a point where the 5 men were expressing their admiration for game music. One of them raised the point that it would be great if the word was spread on the quality and magnitude that game music is able to achieve. It didn't take long before they realized that the people in that room could use their history and expertise to make that project happen, and thus Press Start Symphony of Games, a concert that highlights game music through a classical spin, was born. It was the first concert celebrating the medium since Koichi Sugiyama's revolutionary orchestral game concert series. Moving forward, this team of 5 people would be the producers of all Press Start concerts up to its final iteration in 2015, giving them opportunities to meet other important people in the game music world. The prospect of this project got them excited enough to strengthen their bonds and have them join for an even bigger project, Super Smash Bros. Brawl. According to Nobuo Uematsu's accounts of how he was offered the job by Sakurai, it seems like this took place in the same nomikai they met and conceptualized the Press Start concerts. It should be clear by now how this event was a major turning point for Nintendo and Square's relationship. Important artists better known for their work on Final Fantasy VII were joining forces with some of Nintendo's most trusted artists to produce one of the company's biggest games in its history, and it's not just me pointing to FF7 as a point of reference for Nojima and Uematsu being hired. In an Iwata Asks interview on Smash Bros. Brawl, Sakurai referenced the game as a highlight for Nojima's career when talking about the scenario writing for this new entry in Nintendo's crossover series, a reference that Nintendo's president received with enormous reverence. A response contrasting with Iwata's predecessor and illustrating how Nintendo was becoming more open to its embrace of FF7's legacy and the artists who made it. Remember when I mentioned in part 1 of A Living Legacy that a ban on Square employees within Nintendo's headquarters took effect shortly after FF7's release? It was during Brawl's development period that Iwata would lift the ban entirely, opening the door for further partnerships and accelerating the process of re-establishing the distinct relationship these former partners used to have. I'll briefly explore the most meaningful of these new partnerships later on, but for now, let's conclude Brawl's impact on this story. The stage was now set for Smash's new entry to move forward, this time with FF7 artists on board. The game's main theme would be composed by Nobuo Uematsu, arranged by Shogo Sakai, conducted by Taizo Takemoto, and based on the scenario co-written by Masahiro Sakurai and Kazushige Nojima. While Brawl would feature an enormous amount of tracks by dozens of different composers and arrangers, the main theme to this entry in the Smash Bros. Series was by far the most emblematic and important work in the soundtrack. It's the track that not only embodies the culmination of the relationship between 5 friends and artists from Nintendo and Square, but it's also the music that opens the game and serves as the story mode's ending song, with lyrics that reflect the scenario and the characters present in it. Speaking of Brawl's story, I think it's relevant to also give a quick look at its development, as it carries an interesting set of details of Smash's history and gives a few glimpses into both Sakurai and Nojima's artistic tendencies. Melee's adventure mode was a highlight of the game, but its lack of a deeper storyline was something players were demanding fixed in the next entry. Looking for ways to improve the single-player experience with the side-scrolling mode, Sakurai reached the conclusion that investing in a storyline would be the way to go for this project. Because of Nojima's work in Final Fantasy VII, Sakurai asked for his help to build a story with no real main character that is able to cinematically handle the amount of characters Brawl's final roster would have under the backdrop of the lore of the world of Smash. Both would bring their own drafts to the table before discussing the route they would take. In an Iwata Asks interview, Sakurai recalled how Nojima's draft, while having an appeal of its own, didn't tonally fit what he had in mind, and I gather he meant for both the characters and the stakes of the conflicts and world. I guess that wouldn't be the first time. Sakurai wanted something a lot more serious, conceptualizing a story about a calamity that only one character survives and must fight his way through to round up their fallen allies and save everyone. If any of you are remotely familiar with Smash Bros. Ultimate, you'll instantly recognize this premise from that game's story, World of Light. Indeed, said plot was basically conceived all the way back when Sakurai and Nojima were discussing ideas for Brawl's story. In the end, both drafts were shelved, or rather reworked, into a new scenario, leading to the final version we have today, known as the Subspace Emissary. I say reworked because you can find details mentioned from both drafts that vaguely made their way into this adventure. Nojima's idea of characters going into a stadium and fighters sharing space almost in a form of sportsmanship is incorporated in the story's introduction. Sakurai's idea of a calamity that leaves few survivors and having to recover those who fell prey to it, while not the core of the main conflict throughout the story, became a twist and part of the final act. Which of the other parts of the story came from whom is unknown, but one thing is for certain. Despite the gameplay being divisive among fans today, the story of Subspace Emissary ended up being an impressive achievement, managing to tell a conflict with silent characters while conveying with accuracy their personalities and the intricacies to their relationships and motivations. Subspace Story symbolically heralded the scope of the crossover appeal that Brawl was aiming for. The cooperation between Sakurai and Nojima proved to be a worthwhile endeavor, and in a way, it's another instance that shows how much Nojima can shine with a strong direction to guide him. By now, you might already see how this Smash Bros. Title served as a turning point for Final Fantasy VII's legacy making its way into the series. It's a game that had key FF7 artists significantly involved since its inception, with Nintendo's presidents showing reverence to the title and its series publicly. The chances of a Final Fantasy character joining Nintendo's crossover, while slim at the time, started to show potential. That possibility would get even more traction by Brawl's bold take on the crossover aspect through its cast and their associated content. At E3 2006, Super Smash Bros. Brawl was revealed to the public, with a trailer showing new Nintendo characters in cinematic segments and the game's new mechanics. Just when the audience thought the trailer was over, a codec call begins, revealing that Snake from Metal Gear Solid would be joining the roster as the first third-party character in the series. Showtime! The door for non-Nintendo characters was now open, and as a result, fan demands for characters would change knowing that so many new options were now on the table. Snake's inclusion also carried a special meaning to Final Fantasy VII and the fans asking for its presence in Smash Bros. A character who was a significant icon for the PlayStation 1 and whose series had less presence on Nintendo systems than Final Fantasy was selected to join Super Smash Bros. If Snake was accepted for the roster for both its quirky and iconic approach to presentation that is aligned with Nintendo's, on top of Sakurai's own good relationship with the key artists behind that franchise, Cloud Strife, with all the history behind the character and his source material, was a massive candidate for the future, and this didn't go unnoticed among fans. In terms of expanding the number of non-Nintendo characters in the roster, Brawl would only add Sonic after Snake. These two characters would bring a significant number of trophies and other material highlighting the history behind their franchises. Indeed, Smash Bros. Brawl was not only now openly painting itself as a museum for Nintendo game history with its masterpieces and Nintendo Chronicles sections, but it was also significantly embracing history carried by non-Nintendo IPs. With this, the prospect of third-party characters joining Smash would influence fan polls, fan games, and Brawl mods that would spring over the years. A relevant fan game was Super Smash Flash, released in 2006 with a roster featuring Cloud. Meanwhile, the game's successor replaced him for Black Mage. Mods of third-party characters were numerous, but those who were on YouTube around 2010 looking into Brawl mods may recall how often it was to find mods of Cloud's Strife. A lot of the time, even Sephiroth had a mod of his own. Final Fantasy VII's protagonist was proving to be significantly popular within the fan culture of Smash Bros., one that found itself on the verge of a massive boost in popularity from platforms like Newgrounds and YouTube. By this point in time, Cloud was the most popular Final Fantasy character in the world, most likely making the chocobo requests from the Smash 64 days outdated by virtue of Snake's inclusion. Cloud's debut in Nintendo's crossover seemed likelier under that lens. There was only a single hurdle to overcome in order to make that a reality. But said hurdle was a challenge that made it seem virtually impossible. While the corporate relationship between Nintendo and Square Enix was improving, the possibility of Square wanting to reapproach Nintendo to the fullest extent wouldn't matter to either party because Sony still owned part of the JRPG giant. Cloud Strife, a character that Sony had a stake in, promoting Nintendo and participating as one of the highlights for a flagship title that gets people to buy a system that directly competes with PlayStation, wasn't something in Sony's interest. In fact, they were releasing a Smash clone of their own called PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale just a couple of years later. So, if anything, a Final Fantasy protagonist was much more likely to be held out of Nintendo's reach in favor of Sony's own assets and goals. This situation made many fans see Cloud as an impossible feat, painting requests for the FF7 protagonist almost as jokes for the fandom to capitalize on. If you were into Smash YouTube parodies in the late 2000s, you might recognize this excerpt from Brawl Taunts, one of the most popular videos of that era.
Hey guys, wouldn't it be awesome in Brawl if they put in Cloud from Final Fantasy VII? Ike, help me!
You'll get no sympathy from me. I'm the only pretty boy in this game.
Little did Ike know how much things were about to change, to the point of being just a matter of a few years before he would get completely owned, and the Purple Geek would become the Purple Chad that wins in the end. Super Smash Bros. Brawl released on January 31st, 2008 to enormous acclaim from fans and critics, becoming one of the best-selling titles on the Wii of all time. Its success was among the numerous contributions to Nintendo's return to the top of the market with their revolutionary system, which would become their best-selling home console of all time for over a decade. The Wii was a console that, due to the novelty of motion controls that it brought to the mainstream and the explosive success in sales since its debut, attracted a lot of third-party companies and independent development studios to make games for Nintendo. In conjunction with its portable counterpart, the Nintendo DS, being just as successful as the Wii, studios with Squaresoft origins saw this generation as the moment of greatest opportunities as developers for Nintendo systems. Brownie Brown would come off the heels of co-developing Mother 3 with HAL Laboratory for the Game Boy Advance in 2006, and spent this generation working on RPGs for Nintendo DS, building their reputation as a strong development support studio. This would earn them the opportunity to become the go-to support studio for 3D Super Mario games in the following generation of game systems, and to this day, they still fulfill that role to what is Nintendo's biggest and most important franchise. Monolith Soft, previously owned by Bandai Namco, was bought by Nintendo, and it was in this generation that their biggest franchise, Xenoblade, was born. Its eventual impact and localization efforts around the world established Tetsuya Takahashi's company as one of Nintendo's most important subsidiaries, providing support and open-world game development for different IPs, on top of Monolith's own games to enrich the library of Nintendo consoles for years to come. Monolith Soft would be further celebrated by Nintendo through the introduction of Xenoblade's universe and characters into Smash 4 on the Wii U. This was further enhanced in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate with the inclusion of Xenoblade 2 characters Pyra and Mithra as DLC, poetically, right after Sephiroth. Skip Limited, the biggest offspring of Love-Delic, would have the majority of their works made in this era, ranging from Chibi Robo to Captain Rainbow, franchises which also got represented in Super Smash Bros. In the following generations. Vanpool Incorporated, Skip Limited's sister offspring from Love-Delic, started its journey with Nintendo through their work on the Zelda spin-off games focused on Tingle. Yes, those games. Vanpool would truly shine with their new IP, Dylan's Rolling Western, for Nintendo's next portable system, and its protagonist would eventually also be present in future entries of the Super Smash Bros. Series. Grezzo, a company immensely associated today to Zelda remakes of the past decade, was born in the Wii generation with the creator of the Mana series, Koichi Ishii, at its helm. Most of their works came with the 3DS onwards, but it's worth highlighting their humble beginnings with the enhanced port of The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords to the Nintendo DS and their original IP Line Attack Heroes for the Wii. Perhaps the most meaningful of all the Squaresoft-originated studios, however, came in the form of Mistwalker, the company created by the father of Final Fantasy VII himself, Hironobu Sakaguchi. Almost half of the works made by Mistwalker to date debuted in this era for the Wii and Nintendo DS. Their first game on the Nintendo system, Archaic Sealed Heat, pulled from Sakaguchi's love for tactical RPGs like Fire Emblem and Ogre Battle, while adding traditional RPG elements familiar to Final Fantasy. Its main protagonist, Isia, would be included in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate as a spirit, the game's replacement to the series' staple trophies. Mistwalker would later work on 2 Nintendo DS sequels to Blue Dragon, the first game they ever made and one that had its debut on Microsoft's Xbox 360. Their biggest contribution came with the Wii classic The Last Story in 2011. The title alone should already tell you its Final Fantasy sensibilities, but it was a game that also aimed to distance itself from traditional RPG design in favor of a modern philosophy. The Last Story, a product of a collaboration between Mistwalker, Nintendo, and AQ Interactive, was the first time Sakaguchi worked as a director since Final Fantasy V on the Super Famicom back in 1992. While development and release had its fair share of challenges stemming from things like the Wii's standard definition output and Nintendo of America's hesitation to accept publishing the game in the US, it was a big deal for Nintendo to have a Sakaguchi game be a highlight for their system, especially in the Wii's final years on the market. And to Sakaguchi, The Last Story was his opportunity to work on a large-scale project again, arguably the biggest and boldest work done by Mistwalker by that point. Its legacy would live on in Super Smash Bros. As recent as Ultimate, where it is, by far, the most expressive Mistwalker representation in the game. The Last Story was a game that even served as motivation for Satoru Iwata to have Sakaguchi be present in 3 different Iwata Asks interviews, among the highest number of appearances from a non-Nintendo developer in the program. Perhaps the most relevant Sakaguchi interview is the very first one. In it, the Nintendo president highlights how meaningful Sakaguchi's presence was in the program, subtly referencing their separation caused by FF7's development. This didn't just serve to further enhance the fact that Nintendo valued Squaresoft and their old artists. It's a glimpse of something important I want to highlight for the story. Iwata's apparent personal goal as president of Nintendo, among the many he had during his administration, was to make amends with Square Enix and OG FF7 artists, as he tried to recapture the partnership they used to have with Squaresoft-era artists and their IPs. Whether this wish came from the history of his predecessor being felt as Iwata took office, whether it came from his desire to deliver older Nintendo fans what they lost after the jump to 3D, whether this was inspired by demands seen for Super Smash Bros. During his time heading HAL, or, what I think is most likely, whether it was all of the previous motivating factors combined, Iwata's apparent goal was set and would progress steadily into the next generation. You might think I'm looking too deep into it, but even ignoring the fact that this type of objective defined one of his main roles at Nintendo when getting hired, on top of ignoring the entire journey explored by this video thus far, there is still something else to consider that might change your mind, something that will be saved for part 2, so hang in there, my skeptical viewer. By now, we've seen basically all of the studios that originated from Squaresoft artists and how they related to Nintendo from this generation onwards. So what about Square Enix themselves? Well, the company would continue to deliver spin-off games like new entries in the Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles series and Dragon Quest Swords. The former was even highlighted by Nintendo themselves at the E3 Wii showcase in 2006.
Look up, the mothership is about to land, and Square Enix is arriving with an exclusive iteration of its legendary series with Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles.
But this generation also saw significant shifts in Square's output to Nintendo.
Know that if you're a Final Fantasy fan here in the West, there's always been something missing in your life. Final Fantasy III. Well, prepare to be fulfilled. The legendary title is coming to America on the DS.
The DS would receive new 3D remakes of Final Fantasy III and IV, as well as remasters to classics like Chrono Trigger and Dragon Quest V. Of course, FF7 was still under Sony's stranglehold due to the compilation still being a useful tool to attract fans to PlayStation, so that would have to wait still. Among Square's support in the generation, however, the new games were the absolute highlights. Mainline Dragon Quest would finally return to Nintendo systems for new entries with Dragon Quest IX on the DS and Dragon Quest X on the Wii. Seeing Enix's flagship franchise resume the presence it used to have on their systems was a major victory to Nintendo fans, and many would look to this in the hopes of Final Fantasy getting its turn in the future. While this didn't materialize in the same generation of consoles, Final Fantasy would still provide a novel presence in this era. A total of 4 different crossover games by Square Enix featuring Super Mario, Final Fantasy, and Dragon Quest would be released on Wii and DS. While their magnitude was modest by virtue of the kind of games they were, the very fact of Nintendo's mascot coexisting with characters, creatures, and archetypes from both Squaresoft and Enix's main franchises was a sign of progress. Mario would meet Dragon Quest characters in entries to the Itadaki Street series, quasi-Monopoly games that previously served as the stage for Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest characters getting together for the first time since the Square Enix merger. Mario and Final Fantasy would clash to a smaller degree in sports spin-off games. While major mainline characters from Dragon Quest were present in Itadaki Street, Final Fantasy had no protagonists or secondary mainline characters in the roster of the sports games. Instead, the crossover featured the Super Mario cast interacting with characters embodying generic classes from Final Fantasy I adapted to the Mario universe, as well as recurring creatures like the Cactuar and Behemoth. While it was unfortunate no real mainline protagonist was present, these crossover titles, even if very small endeavors compared to mainline Dragon Quest returning to Nintendo systems, were still a major step forward. This was the first Mario and Final Fantasy crossover since Super Mario RPG back in 1996, and this was achieved amidst the stranglehold Sony had over Square. Nintendo and Square's chemistry was starting to rekindle. And so, we now see the generation coming to an end, with the Wii U and the 3DS being Nintendo systems for the coming era. It is no secret that the Wii U suffered tremendously on numerous levels, providing a mostly uneventful era in terms of Square's presence on home console. When it came to Nintendo's portable, however, that was a different story. The system saw the rise of a new IP in the form of Bravely Default, as well as new entries in mainline and spin-off series to major franchises such as Kingdom Hearts and Dragon Quest Monsters. The most relevant works to this story among this new wave of games are the new Final Fantasy spin-off titles and the remakes to Dragon Quest VII and VIII. Yes, Dragon Quest VII, the very same title that dodged the Nintendo 64 in favor of PlayStation in 1997, was landing on the Nintendo platform after all that time. If an entry originally exclusive to Sony's first console could make it back to Nintendo, then perhaps the Final Fantasy game that bridged 2 eras of Squaresoft could also come back in the future. It certainly would signal a symbolic return to what Nintendo and Square used to have, and serve as a sign of what's to come moving forward. While that didn't necessarily come to fruition in this era, the spin-off games FFVII Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy Explorers brought to the table a significant shift in terms of representation of mainline Final Fantasy presence on the Nintendo system. FFVII Final Fantasy was a rhythm game using music from the mainline series, including Final Fantasy VII and titles released originally on PlayStation consoles. It even involved the presence of Final Fantasy protagonists of mainline entries released prior, something never seen before on a Nintendo system. Meanwhile, FF Explorers was an action RPG that featured a mechanic that allowed the player to transform into mainline protagonists and even secondary characters. FF7's Cloud Strife was a major highlight for these games and their promotional material. And it wasn't the version of Cloud that Square was twisting beyond recognition through the compilation. The character's look was celebrating the original iteration as seen by their appeal to the original design, recently made relevant by Square's own crossover game, Dissidia Final Fantasy. Oh yeah, I guess I forgot to mention that, huh? This is probably the best time to bring this work to attention, as it parallels Nintendo's crossover endeavor through a fighting game, and it served as an important reference to Smash Bros.' own implementation of Cloud Strife. As the Nintendo DS released amidst the explosive success of the PlayStation 2, Sony was also on the verge of joining the handheld hardware market with the PlayStation Portable, or PSP for short. This system was a cornerstone to Square Enix's artistic productions of the late 2000s, ranging from origin stories like Crisis Core FF7 and Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep to sequels and spin-offs like The Third Birthday and Final Fantasy Type 0. What a lineup, huh fellas? As a way to celebrate Final Fantasy's 20th anniversary, Square Enix created a crossover fighting game of their own, focusing on the Squaresoft generation of the mainline franchise. Much like Super Smash Bros., Dissidia aimed for a reinvented design to traditional fighting games, concerned with representing characters and their universes through moveset and dialogue, while also creating a new universe where characters from all these different worlds can fit in naturally. Whether Smash served as a direct inspiration to Dissidia or not is something that is up in the air, but this work is an important one to Square's history and a point of reference Sakurai would look into for future inspiration. With that said, let's get back on our journey. The climate between Nintendo and Square was improving rapidly despite the Sony stranglehold. Maybe it was Iwata doing his magic behind the scenes? But you have to wonder, given the situation, how did this happen so close to these spin-offs releasing? I mean, how would Sony allow Square to approve Cloud and FF7's universe joining Super Smash Bros.? They were in the first years of FF7 remake planning and development by this point, and this project was something that would keep FF7 stuck with Sony. There's no way Sony would let this happen unless their stranglehold on Square had to be severed. But I mean, how likely was that to happen anyways? It's not like Sony would have any need to sell their Square Enix stocks just like that, right?
Peter Brown here with a GameSpot news update. Today, Sony announced it's selling off its stake in the Final Fantasy developer Square Enix at a value estimated at $47 million. The deal is expected to officially close on April 17th, and there's no word yet on whether or not this will directly impact Square Enix in the near term.
Fate really does work in mysterious ways, huh? To give context to this situation, Sony was in a state of decline during this period, reporting yearly losses of magnitudes not often seen in the company's history. They were already closing retail stores, selling its PC business, spinning off its TV division, and laying off employees. Despite Square's stocks being sold at a lower price than what they were worth, the JRPG giant still found itself in a favorable position. For starters, they could help Sony in a time of need, much like what came to happen in the early 2000s with Sony coming to help Squaresoft in their time of instability by buying their stocks. This parallel is something that even Shinji Hashimoto called attention to when asked about this topic at the time. In addition, they could also earn this extra freedom that would allow them to get closer to Nintendo again and strengthen their market presence and long-term revenue. This move by Sony would indeed save their earnings as they finished the fiscal year with a profit. It's interesting to note that Sony didn't say why they sold the stock specifically, causing speculation on whether something went sour with Square behind the scenes. The aforementioned account from Hashimoto on this situation painted a scenario where no such thing occurred, but some in the press still recognized the possibility of said account being more positive than it really was. Whether it had to do with Square's bold approach with Nintendo in that generation, or if it was something else, one thing was certain: the gates were open for Final Fantasy VII to finally land on the Nintendo system. Sony would sell their Square stocks on April 2014. On that same year, Smash would see its next pair of entries released.
Cloud is in Super Smash Bros. That is incredible. He's got his limit break. He's got so many cool things. The Midgar stage has summons. He's got his Advent Children costume plus his original. This is some I was punked. I was punked. The world was punked. And I hope you guys are really hyped for more Smash Bros. Cloud from Final Fantasy VII and Smash Bros. I never thought I'd see the day.
Smash 4, as fans call the duology of games made for Wii U and 3DS, was the product of a cooperation between Nintendo, Sakurai's own team, known as Sora Limited, and Bandai Namco for its development, a partnership that will last up to the latest entry in the series we have today. The game served to further Smash's philosophy in terms of its crossover appeal, adding characters from newer titles of old franchises, as well as introducing franchises from Nintendo's history that weren't represented yet in the Smash roster. But by far, the most impactful thing Smash 4 brought to this philosophy was its approach to representation and celebration of non-Nintendo IPs. To give an idea of this new approach, allow me to highlight 3 examples seen in the work. Firstly, third-party IPs that weren't selected to be in the roster could get representation in the form of trophies, such as Ubisoft's Rayman. We have Sonic the Hedgehog getting a second stage of his own, pointing to an interest in expanding content of currently represented third-party franchises in the roster, even if that didn't necessarily mean expanding the franchise's own number of representatives. And finally, the new third-party characters added to the roster in the base game and through downloadable content solidified the classical icon profile of the type of choices made for non-Nintendo characters. With an obvious exception, of course. The adoption of DLC by Smash 4 would give the games an extended development period and more time in the spotlight, moving into the eventful year of 2015. After bringing back popular veterans cut from past entries and introducing the biggest fighting game icon into the roster on November 12, 2015, the payoff to the journey spanning almost 20 years would finally arrive. Cloud Strife, the symbol of arguably Square Enix's most enduring legacy and most pivotal episode in its history, finally made his presence in what is essentially Nintendo's elite cast. The impact of Cloud and the FF7 universe being incorporated into Super Smash Bros. Was perhaps only equally matched by the shock it caused to many fans around the world.
No. Final Fantasy VII?
No way!
What the What? What? Get out of town! Final Fantasy VII? What?
And arguably even in the industry in general. Masahiro Sakurai would even come forth as recently as December 2021 when talking about all additions to the series roster since Smash 4 and recall how Cloud was the most newsworthy among the fighters, demanding the most work to make compared to the other DLC of his time. Fans may have been asking themselves how this accomplishment was even possible, but looking into the work and history surrounding Sakurai, his team, the connections Sakurai made with FF7 artists, and Iwata's own efforts behind the scenes over the years really shows how far they've come to revert the scenario from 1997, and I think this sentiment is perfectly encompassed by Cloud's line as he is revealed. It is very unfortunate, however, that the Nintendo president didn't get to see the fan acclaim to this historic event. Satoru Iwata passed away on July 11, 2015, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire artists across the industry for years to come. Nintendo would hold a direct presentation to fans only months later, and in his memory, a tribute was given to Iwata in the opening seconds. Cloud's entry into Super Smash Bros. Would close out that same presentation. Was this a conscious decision to honor part of Iwata's work? Maybe. Maybe you're still skeptical on this possibility, but there are still more things for your consideration that will be addressed later. As we've reached Cloud's debut in Smash, allow me to highlight the important aspects of his portrayal, promotion, and the content that came with him. After all, how much did the original's legacy live on here? Did the compilation's legacy seep into Smash like it did with Dissidia?
Thank you.
I don't deserve your thanks. I wasn't sure if I could save you.
But you did end up saving me. And I wanted to let you know that.
Even with these doubts, there are still some things I can handle. All right. Let me help.
Are you sure?
Just my way of thanking you. For letting me realize that even I can help someone.
Oh my god. Looking into Cloud's visual presentation, we can grasp a strong tie to the original Final Fantasy VII. His design distanced itself from the compilation, with his iconic spiky hair and the purple Navy soldier uniform seen in Cloud's original art, battle model, and FMVs. Interestingly, the render for the character would go even further with the uniform callback to FF7, giving a stronger tint of purple matching the original look Cloud had with his overworld model. His pose would be the same one from his original art by Nomura and from his victory animation in FF7, referenced as well by one of Cloud's taunts in Smash. The design does take from Dissidia as well, as seen by the black boots, the facial features, and the brown buckle in the middle here. Going by Sakurai's philosophy with designing characters like Mega Man and Pac-Man, the main intent behind Cloud's look is to visibly match the original's feel, even if it takes elements from other sources. And on that front, I'd argue they were successful. But if they were to improve it in the future, it would be a major plus if they made Cloud's eye design closer to the 90s anime look of the original. Just please, don't ever change his original design to remake Cloud. That would really suck. The alternate costumes made around this design are also worthy of note. Almost all of them follow the color coding for the soldier classes in FF7, with the red alt being the second class uniform and the blue alt being the third class uniform. The black alt is a bit ambiguous. It could represent the retcon color coding for first class soldiers from Crisis Core, a retcon later doubled down in Final Fantasy VII Remake. But I think it could also represent a specific first class soldier, Sephiroth. At the time, Cloud was the only representative of FF7, and so having the man in the black uniform represented would make sense, especially given his immense popularity among FF characters in general. Fox McCloud had an alt dedicated to his nemesis absent in Smash 4 as well, so the precedent is there. The hilt of the Buster Sword here also possesses a color scheme not different from the hilt of the original Masamune. Just some food for thought. You decide which one makes the most sense. Looking at Cloud's animations and moveset, it's easy to notice a lot of it is either original to Smash or pulls from FF7 in some form. All aerial moves are original except his forward aerial, a reference to Braver, Cloud's first limit in FF7. Jabs and tilt attacks are all original except his forward tilt, a nod to his slash attack seen in FF7. And down tilt, a move used by Cloud in Ehrgeiz, a fighting game which will become relevant in Part 2. His special moves, with the exception of down special, are other limit breaks Cloud performs in the original game, albeit with Smash-specific functionalities. Fun fact, but an instance where the level of care put into Cloud can be perceived is in a small detail I imagine even hardcore Smash fans might have missed. Curse Slash, translated as Cross Slash in the official localization, is Cloud's side special. Side specials are a type of move that is usually mirrored in visuals and hitbox with every character in Smash. Due to the attention put into drawing the kanji from Cloud's point of view, developers made sure to preserve the accurate perspective for the kanji when facing left or right. This means Curse Slash looks and hits differently when changing the direction Cloud faces, a one-of-a-kind side special quirk. Very subtle but beautiful detail put into the character, making him even more unique in the cast. Back to where we were, Cloud's down special, Limit Charge, is a Smash original, but it was designed to emulate the mechanic of limit breaks from the original game, as a bar is filled to perform ultimate versions of Crime Hazard, Curse Slash, and Rending Light, in addition to unlocking Finishing Touch, a limit that works as an extension of Cloud rather than a projectile like in the original. To finish off this facet of Cloud's representation, it's worth highlighting how FF7's sound effects were integrated into the moveset, something Sakurai himself would draw attention to in the character's showcase. Slashes and special moves feature sounds that are slightly altered but very close to the original versions. Here are some of them. If I were to give a suggestion for improvement, I'd add these sound effects as well to further enhance this approach with FF7 characters. In the end, the integration of FF7 sound effects as part of Cloud's representation is a subtle touch that sells the strong ties to the source material. His taunts and idle animation all originate from Final Fantasy VII. Well, mostly. Yes, I'd even say this one. Cloud's idle animation starts as his battle stance from FF7 before he checks his sword in two different poses while beholding the magnitude of his weapon, this final part being a Smash original. Up taunt, as previously mentioned, is Cloud's victory animation from his source material. Side taunt is him casting a spell, an identical animation from what is seen in FF7, and lastly, his down taunt might seem like a Smash original, but this actually seems to be the pose he makes when Cloud feels or wants to give off the impression he's confident and strong to others in FF7. In the original game, the Buster Sword couldn't be rendered with Cloud in the overworld at all times due to hardware limitations, so scenes with animations like these demanded from the imagination how he'd use or position his sword. What we see in Smash seems to be the interpretation Sakurai and his team had of those moments. For Cloud's final smash, we have Omnislash, his final limit break in Final Fantasy VII. While the visual effects look new, the presentation harkens back to the source material with the presence of the pink text box that shows up on the upper part of the screen, which is how limit breaks were presented in the original game. Amidst Cloud's moveset and animations, his dash is an exception in terms of origins, perhaps being the most blatant nod to Dissidia Final Fantasy. While Sakurai mentioned Advent Children as a reference for Cloud's flight close to the ground, the animation in Smash was definitely made closer to Dissidia's dash animation for characters in the air, something Sephiroth would also have in Smash. Curiously, this gliding detail kind of aligns with the original FF7's animation of Cloud going to the enemy before giving a slash, an animation that would be represented more faithfully in Sephiroth's Smash review despite the Advent Children attire. Looking at everything I broke down on Cloud's animations and moves, I think you're probably starting to get the idea of how much care and reverence for the original Final Fantasy VII was present in Smash's take on Cloud. But you might be asking, what about character portrayal and story elements? After all, Dissidia Final Fantasy had Cloud looking the part, but his portrayal matched the unrecognizable and misguided characterization of the compilation titles. So maybe this could repeat here, despite the unusual love given to the original game? Well, animations already convey a lot of character, and looking at what was already covered, we can see how coherent Cloud is to his original self on that front. This is a character that moves not just as a strong character, but one that exudes confidence and a cocky attitude that are intrinsic aspects of his character. Cloud's Smash review trailer also gives us a glimpse of this idea. Even outside the animations, the trailer also pays homage to aspects of his personality and history, such as Cloud's motion sickness, a key character element that served as the first point of inconsistency behind Cloud's narrative of his past in the original game. When looking at his lines in Smash, we can grasp this direction further. This is the cocky and confident persona that defined Cloud as a character, both in his period of amnesia attempting to sell his image as a first-class soldier, as well as in his period of acceptance of his identity. It's clear that Smash went through the effort of preserving the protagonist's personality and history beyond the time frame of FF7 that Square has rehashed in later media. This Cloud is the one we know and love from the 1997 classic. With all the Smash history we've explored, it's clear how much this direction is an offspring of Sakurai's philosophy of preserving the essence of characters in the roster and their history as accurately as possible. While Square Enix spent the previous 14 years building a completely different identity for Cloud and his universe with their compilation titles and Final Fantasy spin-offs, Nintendo was giving the spotlight to the legacy of the original game and characters almost 20 years after FF7's release. I think there is a kind of poetic irony in how Cloud's debut in Smash took place in the same year that Square announced their long-term commitment to revisiting Final Fantasy VII's universe. A revisit that, well, certainly ended up remaking a lot of people's fears and wishes for the future of FF7's legacy. Back to where we were, let's explore the rest of the content Cloud offered for Super Smash Bros. Since we took a glimpse at his review trailer for moveset and animations, I think it's worth making an addendum to highlight the remaining references to FF7 in general. The trailer covers small tidbits from the source material, like Cloud casting Frog here, and the transition from overworld into battle recreated in this scene here, as well as significant moments from the game's story, like the scene with Zelda and Kalos referencing Aerith finding Cloud unconscious in her church, and the final battle between Cloud and Sephiroth reenacted here with very similar camera angles and flashes. Very nice callbacks. Moving on, like every new character introduced through DLC, Cloud brought a stage of his own to Smash, Midgar. The iconic city from Final Fantasy VII makes an appearance in a much larger scale compared to its original counterpart, with a wide perspective shot that shows some good attention to detail referencing the source material. Some examples of this include Sector 6's incomplete state, Sector 4 being an industrial-centric district, and the lack of the Mako furnace from Reactor 8. I'd also like to highlight how aligned the stage design is to the cyberpunk aesthetics from FF7, from the metallic platforms and panels to the pipes, tractor, and other apparel seen around the structure. The tractor not possessing the mechanical hand from Sector 6 is missed potential though. Story-wise, the stage reflects the state where Midgar found itself in the opening seconds of FF7, as seen by Reactor 1 up and running here. Probably the main attractions for the stage, not competitively speaking of course, are the summons, recurring mythological creatures of the Final Fantasy series. Just as in the original FF7, summons appear after a character gets a hold of a red materia, bringing their signature moves into the fray. Looking at the stage and its features, you can tell a lot of care was put into it. The one thing that isn't as accurate is the lighting surrounding Midgar. Instead of the dark night sky only lit up by Mako reactors and the powerful lights coming from Shinra HQ, we have a bright environment with a strong green tint lighting the clouds and the city in general. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong, and I do imagine the brightness was introduced maybe to help some players see the characters and stage without them blending with the background, but it would have been more aligned with FF7 if it was like the FMVs, something this mod here aimed for with great success, and it looks good to play in. This lighting issue was thankfully mitigated by Smash Ultimate's revisit to the stage, a version that is closer to the source material than its Smash 4 counterpart. It's not perfect of course, but it's a welcome improvement. Overall, Midgar is a great stage that shows a lot of consideration for the source material, featuring arguably the most extravagant features of all DLC stages in Smash 4. With that addressed, let's move on to the trophies that came with Cloud. Smash 4 DLCs usually brought 3 trophies of the character in question each pack, not bringing much extra representation and celebration of the new universes added. The exceptions to this were Ken for Street Fighter and Bayonetta's 7 trophies. In the case of Cloud, FF7 got the same treatment as DLCs from veteran franchises, so no Aerith, Tifa, Barret, or even Summon and Chocobo trophies were added. Only a base game presence in the future could provide that universe its rightful representation. At least that was what the fans thought. Despite this setback, Cloud had some assets in other areas of the game that truly made him seem special among the cast. At the end of the credit sequence for Classic Mode and All-Star Mode, a congratulations screen can be formed, with each character having their own for each mode in question. Cloud screens, referencing the original game's cover art and the Nibelheim incident, also had a font change to the one used in mainline Final Fantasy logos. But they went a step further by making the paint strike behind it colored to resemble Meteor in the FF7 logo. Even the resizing of said paint strike makes its shape closer to Meteor, perhaps intentionally. What takes the cake for special traits for Cloud is most definitely his victory theme. For context, even after Cloud, all characters in Smash 4 had a victory theme that played in the result screen before the Smash 64 menu theme played in the loop. When Cloud wins, however, a very faithful Smash remix of the Final Fantasy Victory fanfare plays, and, like in the original game's result screen, the melody of the fanfare that is unique to FF7 is looped afterwards, a truly poetic touch that made Cloud stand out among the rest. This approach to victory themes would later be revisited in Smash Ultimate with a number of characters as a tool to further enrich a character's representation of their source material, and that continued even with Sephiroth. Looking at all of this, it seems like Cloud's content was very solid in terms of volume of content from the original game and how that reflected in impact and quality of representation within the limitations of Smash 4 DLC. This is further compounded by Square only recently being set loose by Sony and how little the company mingled with DLC content and collaborations before Smash Bros. But there was one aspect of FF7 representation that stood out for its barren state: the musical selection. Final Fantasy VII having only 2 tracks in Smash was something memed into oblivion, serving as fuel for an erroneous perspective that this took place because of sour relations between Square and Nintendo. This was a take often adopted by Smash fans critical of Cloud's inclusion as well, a lot of them being Nintendo fans of the post-N64 generation I mentioned earlier in this video. But folks familiar with Final Fantasy and how music is handled could get an idea of what the situation actually was. Each Final Fantasy entry is treated as its own IP, with a soundtrack that has historically been under distribution rights from a substantial amount of companies not controlled by Square Enix. If you own a YouTube channel and got a copyright claim on an FF7 music, you might see this exact thing for yourself. The music rights are handled this way because Square was among the first gaming companies to see value in their music and tried distributing albums of soundtracks in an age where most companies in the industry didn't have the money and know-how to make it happen, on top of game music barely being recognized as music to be taken seriously. Nintendo would have needed more time and money than what they had available at the time to overcome the legal hurdles necessary to bring more than 2 tracks to Smash 4. Sakurai would come forward years later to shed light on this and shoot down the disinformation in the fandom that Square was being stingy with FF7 songs. Hopefully that solved the issue. With this, we're almost done with Cloud's content in Smash. Many OG FF7 fans in the audience are probably waiting for me to address the elephant in the room: the presence of Advent Children amidst this celebration of Final Fantasy VII. Those of you are probably asking, doesn't the acknowledgement of such a divisive and conflicting work taint the idea of Smash serving as a worthy pinnacle to the preservation of the original FF7's legacy? Indeed, half of Cloud's alts are dedicated to his motion picture design, fittingly presented in the same pose as Cloud's Dissidia artwork. Even Cloud's splash screen in the review trailer had a tessellation pattern representing Genova cells iconic from Advent Children. Being upfront here, if it were up to me, I wouldn't add any of the Advent Children alts. Instead, I would create more alts of the original design to reference Aerith, Tifa, Barret, and young Cloud. Thankfully, when looking at how much the film impacts the representation of the original game's content in Smash Bros., it becomes clear that Advent Children's presence is minimal. Outside of the aforementioned instances of Advent Children representation, you really only have his entrance animation referencing the end of the film's final battle and the blue aura representing Cloud's limit gauge being full. The film has nothing else. It's interesting to note that even the characterization was intentionally highlighted to be less like the one Advent Children chose to go with. Sakurai would express this in an interview for Nintendo Dream, where he mentions his idea of Cloud being a fundamentally detached character and how boring it would be for battles if this detachment was taken too far. The Smash Bros. Director may not have named the film specifically in that instance, but it's staggeringly accurate to the approach seen in Advent Children. Sakurai seeing how lame that characterization would be in Smash is something that will never stop being cathartic to me, especially in looking at the irony in Dissidia's treatment of Cloud's character. In the end, the presence of Advent Children seems more like a nod to the generation of the FF7 fandom that came to love the compilation, an audience that had very little presence in Nintendo fandoms and consumer base, at least back then. Or it just served to make Smash fans think they're playing as Ichigo from Bleach, who knows. I'd wager, however, that on top of the interest behind attracting a new audience, the main reason Advent Children was chosen to have a presence was because of it being the film that gave Sakurai the chance to connect with FF7 artists that helped make this event possible in the first place. Regardless of the film's quality, the symbolic meaning it carries to Smash history transcended its underwhelming legacy for many Final Fantasy VII fans.
I don't know about you, but the fact that I woke up this morning and said to myself that Cloud is in Smash is still shocking the shit out of me. A sentence that I've never ever thought I would say. But it happened. 2 days ago, Daddy Sakurai rocked our worlds. Now, Of course, I know a lot of you guys are saying this was definitely one of the most important announcements in Smash history, but you're wrong. It's not just one of the most important announcements, it is the most important, monumental, significant action ever done in Smash Bros. History, the whole game series history rather.
With this, we've finally explored Cloud's debut to Super Smash Bros. To its full extent. The character got immensely popular, competitively becoming among the strongest characters in the game. It was a dream come true for many Nintendo and Final Fantasy fans for a variety of reasons. Despite this acclaim, looking back at the online fan reception to Cloud and Smash at the time of reveal, especially in the West, it can be quite odd today to find a good number of people significantly distressed over the inclusion. The common complaint was Cloud being a quote-unquote fundamentally non-Nintendo character, even more than Snake, somehow, taking the spot of a quote-unquote real Nintendo era character like Black Mage? Yeah, these folks definitely knew what they were talking about. Adding to this was a concern of Smash having too many guest characters, losing the Nintendo aspect of the series, which is curious considering said characters were being selected with a Nintendo-oriented appeal and history in mind. Sakurai would reference these criticisms in his Famitsu column in the month following Cloud's release. As you can see, a lot of these criticisms came from those ignoring this long history and the artistic approach FF7 had. Indeed, the game wasn't on the Nintendo system yet, and Smash Bros. Historically looked to the past and present as references for selecting which universes to include and celebrate, but it was absurdly naive not to see this as the turning point for the future of the relationship with Square. If anything, it was a prelude for what was to come, and it would kickstart Smash's own tendency to start looking at the future as well when building its cast of characters. In the end, Cloud's inclusion to the roster was made for a variety of motivating factors. The impact of this event led to a dual interview by Famitsu with Masahiro Sakurai and Tetsuya Nomura. In it, Sakurai mentions Cloud getting between 1/4 and 1/3 of the total requests for a Final Fantasy character from fans, and it was his desire to fulfill this wish in Smash 4. There is also an appreciation for the Final Fantasy series that Sakurai himself seems to have, which might have also played a role in this decision. Sakurai's 500th Famitsu column lists Final Fantasy as the series Sakurai most talked about in his career as columnist outside of IPs he directed. However, looking at the DLC characters following Cloud, you can tell Nintendo most likely had an influence in the roster selection near the end of Smash 4's development. Looking at the history between Nintendo and Square and what Cloud in Smash would mean for the future, it's possible Sakurai also received guidance and support from Iwata during planning and negotiations. The successor to Smash 4, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, had its entire DLC roster selected by Nintendo, and among those characters was Sephiroth, pointing to the company's active interest in Final Fantasy VII and its presence in their crossover series. So it seems that Cloud's inclusion was motivated from both an artistic and corporate level, and that corporate interest was soon to pay off. And so, kind viewers, we reach the end of part 1 of this A Living Legacy Encore on Super Smash Bros. It has been quite an eventful journey so far, with a big turn of events that shocked the world at the time and the long-awaited reunion bound to happen in the coming years. The limitations within this collaboration may have still left many skeptical on Cloud and Smash carrying any meaningful implications, but those who followed it all up close saw what was to come. Rarely do I get the chance to share my own experience with works of art discussed on this channel, mainly due to the more normative and analytical focus I prioritize in my videos, but I think this story is a special case for me. I watched this history unfold with my own eyes. As a Nintendo fan myself, I got to play Smash Bros. On the Nintendo 64 just as it released, and as Melee came by, Cloud Strife became my most wanted character. For almost 15 years, I waited for what is perhaps the biggest payoff I ever got from Nintendo's crossover series, only matched by the FF7 villain's inclusion half a decade later. That reveal in 2015 was nothing short of magical for me. Back then, I had little to no exposure to online forums focused on Smash and Final Fantasy, and I never got to record any reaction like so many do now. Heck, I never imagined I would have a YouTube channel and get as far as I did. How far things have come. And on that note, I want to thank you all for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, share with friends, and comment down below. It's the only way YouTube suggests this content to new viewers. If you want to support the channel further, please consider donating on Patreon. It's the only way I can make a reliable income from this endeavor and have it become a full-time job. You can find my Patreon in the description. I'd like to take this opportunity to also give my special thanks to my Patreons for their financial support, helping me in a time of need and assisting in this channel's growth. And also, a warm welcome to my distinguished new Patreons, Nicolaus Valoria, William Hamilton, and Stereo Knights. And finally, thank you for all the support given all this time. This channel has only grown since the very first part of A Living Legacy, and it's all thanks to you and your presence. To all of the contributors who directly helped make this Encore possible, a special credit sequence for you will be saved for the conclusion of this video duology. For now, know that you have my heartfelt thanks. Your support is immensely appreciated and crucial to making this work as good as it ended up being. In the next and final part of this Encore feature, we'll be exploring the run-up to Final Fantasy VII's debut on the Nintendo console and finally behold the arrival of the fallen soldier into Super Smash Bros. I'll see you all then. Until next time.